Uh, Professor Fetzer, thank you so very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. How would the second Trump presidency reshape global trade dynamics, given his previous and current tariff policies and confrontational trade stance? Which sectors and economies are most vulnerable to renewed trade wars?
Couldn't be a more difficult or intriguing question. I think one important part is to understand a little bit of kind of what the international division of labor has been, so to say, within the last 10, 15 years, to understand a little bit the context of the US's sort of trade policy maneuvering. Again, that's my interpretation of the data and the evidence. It might be wrong, and so one also needs to sort of factor that in. But if we think about the global division of labor that has emerged over the last 10, 20, 30 years, is that the US is sort of specialized on financializing the world, focused on, in particular, service sector trade through its digital tech companies and through its specialization in knowledge production and innovation. Whereas China, on the other hand, has, onshored and localized a lot of production and has been very strategic in sort of building dominance over many supply chains. In particular, the type of supply chains that I would deem are important for the world to deliver on, common global needs such as climate action. It's very clear that, China is one of the domain leading players when it comes to the technology around decarbonization, be it renewables, be it photovoltaics, be it wind, be it electric vehicles. And so at some level, the US sort of has specialized on service sector trade, whereas China has sort of very strongly and aggressively sort of strategically developed a dominance in terms of capturing value chains in what some would say are the future industries, or some would say are the industries that are necessary to actually deliver global action in the climate domain. And that is the context to which I understand the confrontational sort of developments in the sphere, in particular geopolitical rivalry between the US and China. Europe is also sort of playing in this game, but Europe has never deindustrialized to the same extent as the US has not sort of gone down that specialization route. And so this is the context in which I understand the sort of confrontation and also the geopolitical maneuvering, because through the control of strategic minerals and supply chains, some geopolitical actors, in particular, as I was mentioning, China, is sort of having a lot of leverage in its, in sort of, shaping the geopolitical contest. And the US is sort of obviously very aggressively now trying to turn the steer around through a shift towards industrial policy, which sort of, and also, very possibly aggressive attempts to secure access to critical minerals and supply chain. Of course, all of this is happening within growing disputes over what is it being traded when a country specializes in service sector trade, in particular knowledge production, innovation, and so on. It's the protection of intellectual property. And this is sort of a point of contention between, China and the US in this domain, because there's a perception that not all countries are honoring the protection of intellectual property and knowledge in the same way. So it's not subject to the same governance regime. And I think that's sort of, again, an important backdrop of the geopolitical contest that is unfolding, and can explain some of the more aggressive stances that the US is taking. Because, yes, I would think the US has been outmaneuvered in some ways by geopolitical, players. Again, critical minerals is one prime example. I think there's been efforts of both European players as well as the US to secure and build supply chains for critical minerals, rare earths, and whatnot that are vital for the technologies of the future, such as, obviously chips, as well as, it's a very critical component to many of the renewable energy value chain. And China has been using its control both of the technology of refining the minerals to sort of produce the processed minerals, as well as its control over the access to the mineral resources around the globe. I mean, it helps that China is host and home to a lot of the reserves when it comes to critical minerals, but it has been weaponizing the fact, or I mean, one interpretation is it's been weaponizing the fact that it is not subject to a market-based mechanism, whereby any attempt when other countries were trying to sort of build up supply chains have been sort of cobbled and hampered by the strategic release of minerals from strategic reserves that would then destroy the prices, which would then sort of get private enterprises through which most of public policies operating in Western-based, market-based economies would just not be able to sort of, make ends meet, so to say. And so any threat of challenging the critical mineral supply dominance of China has been undermined by the fact that China is not a market economy. And sort of it's been deploying its strategic reserves. And that actually mirrors to some extent some attempts that we've seen in the early 2010s when, in the US, shale oil and shale gas emerged as a dominant technology to meet domestic energy needs in the US. And in the Middle East, tensions arose because the energy partnership between some players in the Middle East, in particular, in UAE, in particular Saudi Arabia, who historically would have exported a lot of the crude to the US for refinement, basically lost their export market, but also lost their capability of actually controlling crude oil prices globally, or having a lot of influence over crude oil prices, because it turned out that shale was a type of swing production capability. And so there is some sort of echo that I see here, that sort of, again, pits two economic systems and social systems against one another. And the prime challenge here being for the US and sort of Western players is that the temporal horizons over which policymakers who are politically in charge at any given point in time are typically much shorter than, let's say, in non-democratic countries, as per our definitions of representative democracy. And I think all of these tensions are coming out to the fore, and the US is sort of acting quite aggressively to counter that, and is deploying trade policy as one of its tools.
Right. What are the long-term risks of Trump's trade policies for global economic stability, with the US not only decoupling from China, but also distancing itself from the EU and shifting alliances? How might geopolitical fragmentation and economic realignment unfold?
Again, I mean, there's ways of like trying to sort of think about future paths. I mean, on average, I would like to think that the US specialization in service sector trade, which is actually also something that the UK, in particular the Brexiteers, were strongly advocating, has made the UK and the US quite vulnerable, because service sector trade, in particular when it comes to digital economy, digital goods, and so on, there is a relatively high degree to which you can potentially localize it. Because in the end of the day, I mean, right now, a lot of the digital services that we consume are basically stewarded by the global tech platforms like, Google, Microsoft, and whatnot. But we've seen, for example, in Latin America, where language was a bit of a barrier, there's strong and big players that can emerge in that realm and actually capture and control some of these value chains so that it doesn't sort of, fall under the remit of the big major US brands. I'm thinking of, in particular, like Mercado Libre in Latin America, as well as obviously in China, there's a whole big tech ecosystem because the market never opened up for the big tech players. So that's an important part for when it comes to service sector trade. And in particular, around that element of service sector trade, there's always been a political tension because a lot of these between the EU and the US that can be traced back well into and before the first Trump administration, where the big tech companies are essentially making a ton of money of a product that scales very, very easily, right? So you have one piece of tech information that just scales incredibly to a large market. And the global governance framework around service sector trade is just not particularly well suited, to capture for these type of phenomena when all of a sudden you have one source of innovation and you have an infinitely large market. And however, our tax and sort of tax systems around it obviously are very much shaped and have been sort of created with the intention of goods trade behind the scenes. And this has been a wedge issue, for example, in Europe, where by a lot of the big tech companies would sort of access and tap into the very large European market and transfer price the profits away into offshore tax havens within Europe. And under Trump 1, which was, there was big attempts by both the UK and France to sort of move in towards levying digital service taxes, which would essentially undermine the US advantage when it comes to service sector trade, because right now the economic situation globally is one where the US is exporting services and knowledge and innovation to some extent, has that protected through various intellectual property agreements and obviously transfer pricing, all of these sort of mechanisms in place, while at the same time essentially absorbing a lot of the excess production that happens. So, there's a trade imbalance when it comes to services, and that there's a trade imbalance when it comes to goods. That's been sort of traditionally the global division of labor. Trump challenged this in 2016 because with the very aggressive tax cuts after European countries sort of moved in on trying to sort of levy taxes on the digital service companies through the digital service taxes, in the absence of a global accord on taxation, has tried to sort of do away with this with the first round of tax cuts, which made it very cheap for a lot of the American tech companies to repatriate the profits that they've been sheltering in offshore havens. And of course, what this was doing, it was challenging the existing global division of labor. Europe and China produces goods and the Americans are exporting services with varying degrees of market access. With China, they never had the type of market access, the big tech companies that they had vis-a-vis Europe, but that was challenging that equilibrium. And so at some level, with Trump 2, I expect a continuation of Trump 1, in that domain whereby sort of service sector trade is pitted against goods trade. I do think on average, the US economy can become a lot more rebalanced when it comes to, leaning in on industrial policy, sort of rebalancing, a little bit away from services. It's gotten a little bit out of hand, but the US will probably struggle to accept that this might come with a rebalancing of other countries' economies as well, which would then induce the type of localization of, for example, tech trade that we have seen, quite successfully in Latin America as well as in China, which could mean the arising of tech companies that have more geographic focus or even, let's say, explicit localization mandates, potentially facilitated by different regulatory regimes around the governance of private data, which is something that has been a feature of these discussions. But it can be a very frictional context in which this unfolds. The difficult security situation in Europe, in particular, with very aggressive moves by Russia, aggression, kinetic warfare, can potentially accelerate this, especially if it's not clear anymore whether the US is a partner as opposed to an adversary in this domain. And that's, of course, I mean, 3 years ago, I warned of that, after the war started in Ukraine, that, it could bring a second Trump presidency, could bring an end to the NATO alliance, which, of course, for Europe is a big problem because it has been part of the international division of labor, so to say, that
Right.
Europe accepts the big tech companies with quite ease of market access and actually not being coupled with tax liabilities that arise because they've been priced away into Ireland or offshore havens. I think once that equilibrium is being rattled, I would expect moves in that direction. But Europe, on that sense, and this is very interesting, Europe might struggle with its own inherent contradiction because, it would require the creation of a type of ecosystem that could create European tech champions. That's very difficult because service sector trade within Europe is far less integrated than service sector trade within the US. Europe is not a union of member states. It's a club of nations that has maintained very high trade barriers when it comes to services. And again, this is sort of, again, what Letta and Draghi sort of highlight, sort of the contradictions of Europe. And intellectually, these have been some of the big narratives and arguments that, on the Brexiteer side in the UK have been sort of championed, that, the future is about service sector trade. And Europe struggles actually with integrating its economies to actually facilitate smoother trade and services. And so, again, it's very dangerous, but at some level, possibly necessary if we are in a situation where the global trading system is not subject to common governance standards. And of course, we've seen a deterioration of that since at least 2016. With escalation of trade conflicts. And so, yeah, it's very dangerous situation right now, very challenging. And all of that obviously happens within, a climate crisis, rapid movements, irregular population movements, a weaponization of illicit migration, demographic challenges. It's we are in a very, very, very fraught, very difficult situation.
Your research highlights economic discontent as a driver of populism. How might Trump's policies, such as protectionism or tax reforms, exacerbate or mitigate this trend globally?
Again, when we look at discontent, discontent oftentimes can be attributed to not necessarily people being materially worse off. I mean, if we zoom out, we actually are in a situation where, the world's never been richer as before, as in like people are well off. We don't have, the type of abject poverty that we've had. And even in Europe, despite it all, where, populism is growing, we've had, still relative remarkable, even though slow, but gradual rise in living standards. I think the big challenge with populism is that it's very successful in channeling narratives around discontent. And this is where my past research, for example, on austerity sort of comes in. In the UK context, we had the withdrawal of the state from many functions. There was a big wave of technology optimism, not dissimilar from what we see around now with AI, that says, well, hang on, we can actually automate and make the state and public services much more efficient, and thereby actually lower the burden on the economy to finance the functioning of our public institutions, our public goods, so to say. But all of that happened in the context of structural change. How we consume has changed because we've had the emergence of the internet. That led to a decline in, it led to an acceleration of structural change, which many people perceived as a worsening of the lived environment, a change in the status quo. And I do think across people's life cycles, the older you get, because populism oftentimes is associated. In the UK, there have been two polities, two groups that have been advocating for essentially Brexit, or the strongest supporters of populists. It's typically older people, and there's a degree of protest voting against sort of a status quo that people perceive as not changing. So essentially the populism brings together like a weird unholy coalition of one group of voters that doesn't like any type of change. So when, for example, the high street is visibly declining, people cannot access, their shops anymore, or sort of their regular sort of habits. They cannot lean into their habits anymore. The older you get, the more insecure this makes you feel, because you might struggle with the rapid pace of technological change, because, well, we're not very good at educating and lifelong learning, and having institutions in place for lifelong learning that can make it easier for older people to adapt to a rapidly changing world. And of course, for those individuals, simple populist messages that sort of blame the visual decay and perceived decay of their environments onto outsider groups, be it immigrants, be it foreigners, be it China, be it other sort of players, is always an easy mechanism. Even though we know that in the hard data, in the communities where populism thrives, basically there are no immigrants. There's no lived experience of that. And so that highlights that there's just a big disconnect between the hard data, as in where the immigrants go, as opposed to the perceptions in and around narrative. And that, I think, the big sort of missing gap here is, I've studied this in the context of what I call the media multiplier. The media multiplier and the structure of it has significantly changed with the emergence of social media and sort of the decline of, the traditional media landscape, that again created a whole host of cohorts that might not be digitally literate enough to engage with information or disinformation. Again, that's something that can be weaponized by geopolitical foes, and it has been weaponized, I think, by geopolitical adversaries, so the changing media environment. But I do think that this is what sort of can create that puzzle of populism, which is actually the grievances are a lot in the perception space rather than in the lived experience space. And the disconnect between the two are the narratives that populists are very successful in channeling. And then again, if I go back to austerity, and austerity again is a very important part, because it did hollow out the ability of the state to deliver in certain function. It sort of did shake up certain institutions, like in the UK, there was declines, reductions of like youth clubs. The police presence was visibly reduced. All of these things, affect the perceptions of individuals. And it might have been done in a way that's actually quite rational, because actually, if we look at crime rates, I mean, they have not, it's not like we've gone in from one crime equilibrium to another crime equilibrium, that sort of would actually say, well, we are in a much worse state, but people perceive to be unsafe because they are told they feel unsafe. And of course, every now and then we have an event of a violent attack, a terror attack or whatnot, that sort of like then creates the images that reinforce that perception of a loss of control. That sort of the populists who would have advocate, let's go back to national borders, and if we start raising national borders, we're not far from raising something like the Chinese Great Firewall, that we basically wall each other's societies off the flow of information. That, of course, is potentially quite contrary to the founding ideas of liberal democracy. And so again, to me, it's very important to understand there are physical and visible consequences of accelerated structural change. Having social systems and societies that have been not used to that pace of progress. I mean, if you just imagine the speed at which developing countries are developing, and also the speed at which social change is happening in these countries is much faster than what we experienced in Europe. And so our institutions, and by that I mean our political institutions, our governance institutions, our public sector, that kind of pace is, and the agility is just not mapping into the agility and the space that we see in other countries. That sort of rapidly went from being, in some instances, really dirt poor to being quite well off in a very short period of time,
Right.
within a generation. And so I think this is a lot of the point of frictions that the populists sort of can tap in. You know, we have people that don't like any type of change because the change happens so fast that they can't keep up with processing the change. And then at the same time, our political systems, the democratic sort of political systems, again, there's this quest of controlling for power and the difficulty to explain very complex relationships for the average person, so to say, and that you need to sort of dumb it down, narrow it down into simplistic narratives. And that's exactly, you know, what the populists are also very successful in. And so this is one of the big challenges that I see. So populism is a phenomena of essentially information overload to some extent.
Right. And a question on Germany. How much role did economic grievances play in the strong showing of AfD in German elections last Sunday?
Again, the country is still, I mean, yeah, it's been sort of in recession for the last 2 and 3 years. But if we look at the scale of the economic challenge and the scale of the economic shock, in terms of, you know, the shock that happened with the Russian, you know, invasion of Ukraine, and so, you know, actually the country's done quite well in the grand scheme of things. I mean, it's cushioned the shocks reasonably well, again, in a way that might be irritating global partners, you know, and that's why I suggest that, you know, Putin has weaponized, you know, a potential hypocrisy, because it came with, you know, the invasion. You know, Europe is championing globally climate action and tries to build coalitions for climate action, but at the same time, it massively expanded energy subsidies for hydrocarbons, you know, to sort of help households cushion the shock, help firms cushion the shock. But if we, you know, take that aside, the country and the continent actually has done remarkably well in sort of dealing with this huge blow that is operating in many dimensions. As I said, on the comparative advantage side, you know, there's a loss of comparative advantage when it comes to access to cheap energy, which is a problem for the, you know, industrial base. And then on the other hand, we've got obviously the security shock and the challenge of the international, you know, security order, where, I mean, it was, to me, it was expectable that Trump too could actually start putting in question the, you know, the founding pillars of Europe's security, and that international division of labor. That's why I sort of highlighted this more than 3 years ago. But then it sort of suggested that, you know, on average, it has done quite well in light of and despite that shock. But of course, the AfD has been very successful in channeling that narrative, you know, challenging why Europe should be a champion globally for climate action, why the European Union should be sort of globally a champion for, you know, free trade that is governed by a common rules-based trading system, by the rule of law, not the rule of force. You know, in that broader context, Europe has done well. The individual member states have managed, but the big contradiction and the big risk right now is that, you know, the individual European countries just get basically picked apart one by one, peeled off one by one by geopolitical adversaries. And it looks like the US in some way might be playing part of that game. But again, given the context, I'm actually quite optimistic because, I mean, it's a make or break moment now for Germany, Germany within Europe and Europe as a whole, because to me, it never made sense. I mean, again, I'm making up these numbers, but I mean, they're probably not that unrealistic. For Portugal to have an air force with 4 F-35s, you know, an independent air force with 4 F-35s and whatever, you know, a few tanks, you know, when in fact, you know, it's very hard to land troops, you know, on the coast. Like, you know, there is now a channel and an opportunity actually that this geopolitical pressure that Europe is under, both through the war in Ukraine and the challenging of the security partnership, that actually Europe comes together to build you know, a common integrated defense capability, where the first movements of this have happened before. And so it can be the emergence of European statehood. And of course, because this is happening within a challenging security situation, this will lead to a shift in industrial policy, a shift in sort of thinking about, you know, sovereignty, a shift in thinking of how can we actually build these defense capabilities with partners internationally beyond the European Union, but also with mind of building efficient and sustainable supply chains within Europe. And I start seeing, you know, partnerships emerging with this, for example, in the Middle East, that sort of geostrategically plays an important role for Europe, as, you know, again, the Suez blockade, the recent one, the accidental one, has highlighted, could play an important role. But also with Turkey, again, I think it can potentially bring the UK closer back to Europe again, because the UK will have an interest to participate in that growing pie of European sort of defense cooperation. Which again, the US currently is trying to peel the UK away from. So, I mean, this is again, for me, the context. So I think the AfD has done well because it's tapping into these simplistic narratives in the broader geopolitical context. But the solutions that the AfD is offering are in no way compatible with the challenges that actually Europe faces. And for that, it's really important for, again, you know, the populist parties have this tendency to sort of make a country seem bigger than it is through a big you know, travail. I mean, the UK, you know, had this appeal with the populism, you know, to sort of reinvigorate the idea of the old empire. And when the UK then sort of tries to make contact with the old empire, you know, be that India, be that Pakistan, sort of these are all emerging, you know, powers and important players in the global division of labor. You know, the Indians saying, well, UK, okay, that's interesting. I mean, but you're a tiny country in the grand scheme of things. And this is true for each individual EU member state.
Right.
And so I do think that it's very important for the broader public to actually, you know, gain some reflection in this, that if Germany wants to chart a path that is optimal and best for itself within the world and within Europe, it is utmost dependent on working in conjunction and very close partnership. But again, it's a make or break movement. It's a make or break situation. The geopolitical adversaries, be it China, be it Russia, be it unfortunately the UK now as well, be it the US, they actually have an interest in a divided Europe. And that, again, we see playing out to some extent. And that's where Europe needs to live up and build a type of sovereignty. And to me, that starts with building a European fiscal capacity. That is a necessary condition to make sure that right now, a lot of the founding pillars of the European Union that have been a vector of European integration actually now have been weaponized by the adversaries, which is privacy regulation, you know, the incompleteness of taxes, you know, the lack of integration of national tax systems, information sharing and whatnot. I think all of that will need to change. And I do think that folks like Enrico Letta and again the Draghi report highlighted, the solutions are all obvious. It's now whether we can build a pan-European movement or a pan-European sort of critical mass to actually implement in that direction. But it's really, 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 really challenging, really, really, really difficult, because there's a lot of economic interest group in each of the individual nation states that benefits essentially from the exclusive contracting relationship that these occupational groups have within their national jurisdictions. And that has been the biggest barrier to service sector integration. And it might be the path and the channel of its demise, as in like the demise of countries basically becoming too inward looking, and there being sort of essentially the European project unraveling.
Right. Many scholars argue that cultural backlash, rather than economic factors, drives populism. How does your research challenge or complement this perspective?
Culture is a tricky thing. Again, I think if we look again at the data, I mean, and again, the immigration topic is a salient one, an important one to pick up here. Societies, and in Europe, I mean, the whole idea of the European idea of freedom of movement is that actually we create an integrated European labor market. Kind of, there's an emergence and creation of a European identity and a European culture. And of course, that's very relevant the smaller the country is, because small countries will realize that geopolitically and globally they're just small fry, and they have no way of projecting force, projecting influence, or it's much more difficult. And so I think that's a very important context. To me, the cultural dimension is a very fluffy one. It's sort of the catch-all excuse if you cannot sort of pinpoint down the underlying economic mechanism or societal mechanisms. I've earlier alluded to this challenge with immigration. The biggest backlash to immigration comes from communities that have no experience with immigration. And so that highlights it's an entirely programmable cognition, as in people create perceptions of different social groups, in this case, immigrants, that are in no way grounded by real and lived experience. And that's, to me, the big challenge. If you want to call that culture, be my guest. But again, then if you look at the food system, I think the biggest success in terms of food is, the Turkish, and I put this in quote, the Turkish kebab. My sister lives in a small town in the Swabian Alps. Not the mountains, but sort of the little ridge between, the mid of southern Germany, and one of the most successful businesses in their small town is the local kebab shop, which is an invention of cultures coming together, because that type of kebab you can't get in Turkey, right? And so at some level, it's the product of a product of cultural integration. That's why I think people's perceptions, people's lived experience, and the degree to which they're grounded in hard evidence is the biggest battleground of them all. And I would like to think that the media systems that facilitate that spread of narrative, the spread of stories about the other, the unknown, this is where I think there's a mandate almost for people to become champions of investment in the absorptive capacity of societies, beyond food, which means to actually engage with different cultures, to reach out, and to make sure that we don't leave the programming of our stereotypes to those who buy reach and influence in the sphere. But this is, again, one of the big dividing lines between, and that is sort of starting to emerge between, the US under Trump and Europe, where there's sort of discussions about how can we make social media work better. And I put that in quotes because, of course, it's a very difficult topic to discuss. And so, as I said, like, to cut a long story short, what we call culture is stereotypes, not lived experience in the vast majority of cases of individuals who are actually advocating for remigration or sort of a separation of communities. And I think that's sort of a very important battleground, but it requires investment in the absorptive capacity of societies, and it requires mandates of those that come to share and participate in our way of life. And that's not a static thing. Culture is evolving over time to actually invest.
Right.
Invest in that. And so it's a need for investment in the receiving side, but also in the sending side and those who actually come to us. And of course, Germany in particular made huge historic mistakes in this context, because our Turkish guests were guests. They were expected to return. In the same way with, a lot of the refugees, that came in the early 90s, from Bosnia, there was no investment in that integrating capability. Or a lot of the ethnic Germans who came to Germany following the downfall of the Soviet Union. These were individuals who were entirely socialized in, in Russia or the Soviet Union, but there was no need to integrate them, neither on the language domain nor in the culture domain, because their passport said that they were German, or they had a German lineage. And so I think that's been like a big fallacy. And I think in Germany in particular, there's been significant effort into investing in the integrative and the absorptive capacity. But of course, this primarily happens in medium to larger cities and not in the countryside, where the same mechanisms that take place with immigration, usually it's the entrepreneurial, the people who are not afraid, who sort of migrate. Those are also those who don't have these traits of like seeking out the unknown, being entrepreneurial, being sort of, sort of risk-taking to some extent. Those are the people who stay in their own communities. And for them, obviously, the lived experience might be one that there's no contact, there's no experience. And so I think this is the generational challenge that we face, in each of the European countries. And again, that's why, to me, this sort of term culture is not particularly helpful, because it's sort of like, okay, yeah, we don't actually know. When in fact, I think there are concrete ways of thinking about how, we can actually create vectors for economic integration and for investment in assimilation.
Right.
And there's great examples like that. Big cities are great examples for how this can work. It's just a matter of how we can bring this into smaller communities. And for me, remote working from home is one mechanism through which the benefits from agglomeration, which often comes with a more diverse population in many ways, can actually spread to more and more communities. And through that, we can create and potentially shape, a shared future. Because again, what used to be Germany or German as a culture didn't exist 200 years ago. We had hundreds of little nation states or like little communities and whatnot. And nowadays we have something like a German identity. And of course, the very same ideas are playing out at a European level. And of course, there's some people who think that the very same mechanism should play out at a global level to actually create shared understanding for, prosperity and, sort of shared wealth on this one little planet that we've got.
Right. And lastly, Professor Fetzer, the liberal world order founded on the interdependence after the collapse of communism was once seen as the inevitable future, with Francis Fukuyama declaring the end of history and the triumph of liberalism. With the resurgence of neo-mercantilist and protectionist policies, can we now say that the history is reasserting itself and that the liberal order has become a relic of the past?
I mean, what's implicit in this question is sort of a consideration of what is the role of the state? Because mercantilism is all about, essentially the state. Well, one interpretation in the line of thought of mercantilism is that the state has a mandate to shape economic development in one way or the other, right? Whereas the extreme form of liberalism, libertarianism, is sort of has the premise that the state should not exist. Everything should be guided and subjected to market forces. A lot of the points of tension that seem to arise, at least in my perception, are around charting a future that is more sustainable on this planet. When we realize that our way of life, and by our, I mean probably your and mine, the communities of the global north, actually imposes a negative externality on communities elsewhere. Through global warming, through environmental degradation, through instability that arises from this. There are climate change induced conflicts because people, there's population movements that are already being induced by that in Africa, with nomads not being able to essentially find water spots for their herds anymore. Then they push into cities, and that sort of challenges the equilibrium in these communities. And of course it unsettles if it's happening very fast, and unfortunately it's happening very fast. So my interpretation is that if this is a premise and we need to reconfigure how our economies are working, that actually does require a role for state or supranational institutions to create and shape an incentive structure to engineer a system transition, to a more sustainable equilibrium. And that requires the deployment of a broad economic policy toolkit that might be subsumed under the term of industrial policy. And this is, in my thinking, I mean, the Germans actually started this in the early 2000s with, a high degree of subsidization for, solar and wind, energy production under it, which was done in a way that's non-discriminatory. So it was actually compatible with the global rules-based order, so WTO compliant and whatnot, which means German subsidies helped create the present-day renewable energy giants in China. And so at some level, I have a hard time seeing this as something bad, because it actually promises and offers a hope for a system transition into a way that we can maintain very high standards of living, even higher standards of living, by actually socializing the natural resource rents that come with essentially, energy being, in the long run, the long run cost of energy could converge to basically the cost of capital, right? Because that's, in the end, the solar panels, we've got a lot of space that is barren and empty, where we couldn't actually, produce and harvest, the abundance of the world. But it did require a shift in the policy landscape. This was resisted by some economic interest groups that I would actually not traditionally locate in, traditionally would point the finger towards the Middle East, right? And would say, oh, it's the Saudis, it's the UAE, and so on and so forth. They're resisting that energy transition. I think the biggest resistors of the energy transition that was engineered to a shift in, through a decided shift in industrial policy, very, very much forward-looking, by, in this case, the Germans, the Europeans, and indirectly then by the Chinese, who've like seized this in and around 2008, 2009. It was opposed by the hydrocarbon producers, who are actually facing production costs that are much, much higher than the hydrocarbon producers that we have traditionally in the Middle East. If we look at hydrocarbon production in the Middle East, a barrel of crude costs maybe $10 to produce, if we look at it. So there's a huge windfall still, whereas a barrel of oil that's produced by shale in the US is associated with huge externalities, methane leakages and whatnot, that currently is not properly priced for, but it also is much more expensive. And so, the energy transition, the risk of it was perceived as a big, big risk to some economic interests in certain regions. And this probably includes some of the intermediary cost producers, the offshore producers in Africa, potentially Latin America as well. There's a high cost of capital. There's a risk of stranded assets and whatnot. Whereas the players in the Middle East, they are the last oil producers left standing because they just have very cheap production cost, right? And so to me, this is sort of that transition started towards in the energy system. There was smart industrial policy to capture the underlying value chain, whereas the process of transition that actually was jump-started by Europe, by, in this case, Germany, kept on being repeatedly interrupted by, in this case, I would think it's the hydrocarbon interest from the swing producers, from the mid-cost producers, who happen to be, mostly concentrated. The US is a main home of these, right? And it's not unreasonable to believe that this is the direction of where this is coming from, because in the US, because of the nature of the ownership of mineral rights, like if you dig out oil in anywhere pretty much in the world, it becomes a source of public revenues, or it is under the control of a state monopolist or whatnot. In the US, the landowners own subsurface mineral rights because of very peculiarity in the land ownership. And so you have a lot of small individual landholders who very much invested in non-renewable energies and making sure that these rents keep on going. And I think this explains the particular strong vector of power that these groups have in particular in the US. And so, of course, I would probably think that from a geostrategic perspective, the mid producers in the Middle East, they're like very happy for, let's say, American hydrocarbon interests to do the dirty work for them in terms of lobbying for an expansion or maintenance of, hydrocarbon production in the foreseeable future through their buying in of influence in the political system. But if we then zoom back at it and we say, well, there's the end of history, there's sort of the illiberal economic order that creates industrial policy. Actually, we've always had hydrocarbon-based industrial policy, just through a market-based mechanism where these economic interests were buying influence in and through the political system in and around our democracies. And so I have a hard time sort of like saying, oh, it's black and white. It's the liberal order versus a non-liberal order. In the end of the day, if you need to engineer, and I think that's a global need, it's recognized. If you need to engineer an energy transition, it needs to be a global win-win, and that requires smart people to think about what type of global institutional setup can give us a transition path that creates a global coalition for action. And that means a phasing out of the hydrocarbons in a way that doesn't destroy the planet in the process, while at the same time a sourcing of the alternative and building sort of shaping sufficient incentives for expanding renewables. And so to me, like there has always been some form and pillar of industrial policy. The question is just whether we should think of this industrial policy as within the remits of the nation state, within the remit of collections of states that share a common goal, or within the remits of this happening under the umbrella of a global community. And to me, this is where right now I'm principally worried about that, some players are turning their back on this global commitment because their respective liberal democratic systems are captured by certain specific interest groups that essentially can wield the power of the natural resource rent.
All right.
This is not necessarily something where I would say this is, it's liberal versus non-liberal. It highlights actually the need for some form of public intervention. The question is just who is the player to engage in a public intervention? And yeah.
Professor Fetzer, thank you so very much for your time. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.